In Matthew 24:15, what is the abomination of desolation? So in Matthew 24, Jesus is answering the disciples' question about the timing of the age to come, which is the age between Jesus' first and second comings. So it's the age we're in now. So Jesus starts out with the beginning of the age to come, with the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70 AD. And he finishes with the end of the age to come with his second coming, which is at the end of the Great Tribulation. The difficulty here is figuring out what description through the chapter fits within what timeline, and Jesus is purposely vague in this, not giving us all the details of how it's going to work out. So that's the challenge with reading through this chapter. So regarding verse 15 specifically, the abomination of desolation, Jesus references Daniel, who spoke of both the destruction of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes IV in 167 BC, and it's also referencing the destruction of the temple by the Antichrist in the tribulation that is to come, the Great Tribulation. So many interpreters will say that Jesus is referring to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD from verses 1 and 2 and verses 4 through 35. And then after verse 35, he switches to the end times in verse 36. So the destruction of the temple that happened in 70 AD, only 40 years-ish after Jesus passed. So this is the easiest reading of verse 34 specifically, that Jesus is referring to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD through verse 35, and then at verse 36 he starts talking about the Great Tribulation. However, it's really difficult to explain away all of the apocalyptic language in verses 15 through 35 as just references to the Old Testament apocalyptic literature, which is what you'd have to do if you're saying that those verses apply to 70 AD. Also, in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, but it wasn't abominated in the way that it was with Antiochus Epiphanes, or in the way that it will be in the Antichrist. Antiochus and the Antichrist are doing heinous things in the temple. But in 70 AD, it was more about, the temple was more just being destroyed. Those same heinous acts, abominations, weren't happening. So I believe in verses 1 through 2, Jesus is speaking of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. In verses 4 through 14, I think Jesus is explaining what the age to come will be like. It's between Jesus' first and second coming. So that's our era, the era that we live in verses 4 through 14. In verses 15 through 31, he is describing the Great Tribulation. And in verses 32 through 35, he's summarizing the whole age to come. Verse 34 means the generation will see this new age to come that we're now in, which it did. And verses 36 through 51 are speaking about the timing of the end times, how to prepare for the end times, how to live in this age to come. At the very least, by referencing Daniel, Jesus is seeing verse 15 as a type for the end times, if he's not speaking about the end times directly. I'm sorry, I'm just listing off numbers, but I didn't want to read the whole chapter. I think that breakdown, I'll read that again. In verses 1 through 2, Jesus is speaking of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. In verses 4 through 14, he's speaking of the age that is to come between Jesus' first and second coming, which is the age we live in now. Verses 15 through 31, he's describing the Great Tribulation, that 7-year period where the Antichrist reigns. Verses 32 through 35, he's summarizing the whole age to come between the first and second coming. Verse 34 is referencing this generation won't pass until they see this age to come. And then verses 36 through 51 are speaking about the timing of the end times. How do you prepare? How do you live in the time period we're living in right now. So if you take that structure and you read back through Matthew 24, I think it becomes pretty clear, and it also clears up what the abomination of desolation is referring to. That great tribulation, the Antichrist. Not 70 AD. Any questions on that?
I thought it referred to when the Antichrist came in to the temple and basically declared himself as God and set up his false image.
Yeah.
Does Antiochus do something similar? Set up images to his own gods and make human sacrifice at the temple?
Yeah, and sacrificed pig on the temple or on the altar. Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right. That's what I'm referring to. That's what I'm saying that this passage is referring to. The abomination of desolation is when the Antichrist comes and declares himself king and does heinous acts inside the temple, and that's what this is referring to, not when the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, which is what many interpreters would say. And this futurist interpretation of this passage is pretty consistent across Calvary Chapel as well. Most Calvary pastors think this passage is referring to the Antichrist.